the last section, we added some styling to our button tag, but still nothing happens whenever we press it besides that visual effect. All the touchable components out there, so touchable opacity, touchable highlight, and the other two that we looked at, are some of the few components in React Native that allow us to directly catch feedback from the user. So the idea here is simple. Whenever the user presses on something, they expect something to occur, right? So we need to add a hook or a catch, something into our component that says whenever a user presses this thing right here, run some code. Open up the user's web browser, or maybe fetch a list of posts, or delete a post, or tweet something, whatever it might be. So of course, React Native has us covered on this topic. We can optionally add a prop to the touchable opacity called onPress. So let's do that now. We pass a function to onPress, and then whenever the touchable opacity is pressed by the user, that function will be called. So let's just throw in some dummy function for right now. I'll throw in a console log of pressed, like so. So I passed a fat arrow function. So my expectation is that whenever a user presses on the touchable opacity, I should see a console log of pressed. So let's give this a shot out in the simulator. I'll first bring up my Chrome debugger, and then I'll refresh my simulator. So then I'll do my click here, and you'll notice that my console over here is lagging behind just a little bit, but eventually, yep, I get up pressed, pressed, so on and so on. Okay, so definitely the console log appears. So the trick here, the real challenge, is just remembering a bit of trivia about how we handle user input. If we want to handle a tap event from the user, we can add a touchable highlight or a opacity tag, whichever one we might want, and create an onPress handler. The onPress handler will then be called whenever the user taps on the element. Okay, so that's like step one here. Now we know when a user is tapping on this thing. But we still have two more challenges. Remember, our ultimate goal is to direct the user to a website where they can actually buy this album. Second, right now we are creating this onClick handler inside of this component, this like button component, right? But we want this button to be reusable. So in other words, we don't want this button to know that, hey, whenever you are pressed, you should open like some website, because that would completely defeat the purpose of making a reusable component. If we put a function right here that said whenever you're pressed, open up a website, it would be a very particular use case for a button. So instead, we need to have some way to make sure we've got very generic, very general logic inside of this button component right here, where we can reuse it with other components, completely different use cases in the future. So let's tackle that challenge first. Here's how we're going to take care of it. First, we're going to kind of walk through the code, and then we're going to talk about, or excuse me, we're going to write out the code, and then we'll talk about exactly what's going on. So first, I'm going to flip over to album detail. So here's album detail. I'm inside the render function, and I'm going to find our button tag towards the bottom. So here's my card section inside of album detail. Here's my button tag. I'm going to press, or excuse me, I'm going to provide a prop of onPress to this button. And inside of it, I'm going to console log the album's title. So remember, the album detail has a title property floating around, so I'm just going to console log that title. So now I am passing a prop called onPress to the button. One thing I want to make really clear here, this onPress is not going to be just like naturally, just magically consumed by the button. Okay, we have to make sure that we actually wire up this onPress prop inside the button. I could have just as easily called this thing when pressed or something. I could have called it anything I wanted. I'm just choosing to call the prop onPress. But the point I'm really trying to convey here is calling this function onPress is not the same as passing the touchable opacity in onPress prop. In the case of the touchable opacity, it is expecting a prop of onPress. But right now, as our button is put together, there's no concept of an onPress prop for the button. So we need to make sure that our button actually makes use of that onPress callback that we just added in here. So I'm going to go back to button, and I'm going to say, hey, touchable opacity, whenever you get pressed, whenever someone presses you, I want you to run a function that is provided by the parent component. And so that parent component, the thing that we want to run in here, is coming from the props object. It's going to be props.onPress. So let's do a little bit of destructuring to get access to that callback. So here's onPress. And just to be really clear, this onPress reference right here is exactly equal to this fat function inside of the album detail. So same exact function being passed down as a prop. Now inside the button, we'll say, hey, whenever you get pressed, I want you to run that function that was declared in the parent. That's it. That's all you have to do. So now our button should be a little bit more usable, but let's test this out in the simulator first, just to make sure it's working. So now our expectation is that whenever we press on that button, we should see the album's title be console logged. So I'm going to wait just a minute for my console to kind of warm up. There we go. All right, so there's Taylor Swift. I can go down to the next album, Fearless, Speak Now, and so on. Let's just, what the heck? Okay, 1989, there we go. You get the idea, you get the idea. Okay, so just to review one last time, this is how we make reusable components with React, or I should say this is another technique that we use for making reusable components with React Native. I realized that my button component right here needs to do something differently every single time that a user presses on it across however many times I make a button component inside my application. So rather than telling the button, hey, whenever you're pressed, please open some website, in hard coding that inside of the button component, I instead decided to add in a prop of onPress, and then I told the button, hey, whenever you get called, call that parent prop that was passed, call that callback. And whatever specific behavior was in there, go ahead and let that thing run. Okay, so this is good call right here. Let's continue the next section, and we're going to figure out how to open a website whenever a user presses on that button.